Novelist Vladimir Nabokov was also a very famous lepidopterist. He argued that the Viceroy butterfly was not a mimic of the monarch, but just a lookalike, whose pattern is caused by constraints on pigment diffusion. This video is based on a talk that I gave in 2023 in Lausanne, Switzerland. I'm recording today in response to Michael Levin's Platonic Space Symposium, in which researchers from various fields discuss how mathematical laws constrain patterns, forms, and shapes in the physical world. Levin invites us to think of the Platonic space as a cause of physical processes. A little quick background first. Vladimir Nabokov came out of a tradition of non-Darwinian evolutionary theory. He believed in evolution, but quibbled about the mechanisms. It's hard to pin down Nabokov on his direct influences, but Ernst von Baer was very active in St. Petersburg up until the time of Nabokov's birth there. Nabokov echoes Goethe when he notes that many of nature's patterns were somewhat predictable, quote, variations on a theme, unquote. It's tempting to suppose that he was familiar with Russian Lev Berg, who thought morphologies were limited by internal factors guided by laws. To such theorists, forms might be common, even if they served no reproductive function at all, or were as perfectly non-utilitarian as art, as Nabokov liked to say. Reminiscent of the work of Goethe, in 1924, Boris Schwanwitz, who lived in St. Petersburg, and a German biologist, Fritz Seufert, in 1927, independently found that wing patterns are all variations of a ground plan, comprised of 5 or 6 different pattern elements. It's like the butterfly that doesn't exist in reality, only in abstract. This is from Friedrich Niehuth's 1990 work. He made digital models of reaction diffusion processes to create different elements of wing patterns. The little spoke-like section of the wing is called the wing cell. It acts like a frame that shapes the pattern formation. Here we can see how the various spots and stripes of the ground plan elements can be stretched and pulled into different shapes, depending on chemical concentrations, spatial constraints, and environmental conditions during development. Alternatively to these shapes, pigment may appear vertically down the center of the wing cells, or pigment may appear only near the wing veins, as it does in the very simple Monarch Viceroy pattern. This is Boris Schwanwitz's grave marker in St. Petersburg. Friedrich Niehuth asked me to find it while I was there in 2020 to get a picture of it for him. I went with my friend, former director of the Nabokov Museum, Tatiana Ponomareva, who noted that Nabokov used the name Schwanwitz for a character in one of his early works, an uncommon German name in Russia, so we can guess that this is a nod to the discoverer of the butterfly ground plan. I'm going to talk about new work that I want to do, but I should give you quick summaries of the work I'm building on. My first attempt to understand Nabokov's theory of insect mimicry in 2001 took the form of a working paper at the Santa Fe Institute Center for Complex System Science. In this work, I took a long look at the history of alternative evolutionary theories that have tried to naturalize teleology, describing the physical constraints that tend to predetermine certain forms and lend a direction to evolution. After publication, Nabokov's biographer, an eminent Nabokov scholar, Brian Boyd, and I argued publicly on the Nabokov listserv. Boyd sided with Darwin. I argued that complex systems theory could defend Nabokov's critique of Darwin. That working paper was eventually published in Nabokov's Studies, but first it was rejected because a biologist down the hall from the editorial offices had told the editor that Darwin was right and Nabokov and I were wrong. Fortunately, another editor, Mary Bellino, recognized that, right or wrong, I shed some light on what Nabokov thought about mimicry. Thanks to Mary, it was published, but since it was not approved by peer review, the word forum was printed at the top of each page, like the mark of Cain, which I still bear with pride. Nabokov encountered controversy in his day with this argument. He wanted to write a whole book called The Theory and Practice of Insect Mimicry, but he was discouraged and he never finished it. More than 75 years later, it is still difficult to publish on this topic. In 2009, the 20th Century Literature Journal invited me to write on Darwinism and 20th century fiction. I asked biologist Stanley Salve to co-author the article with me to head off the critics. Unfortunately, the 20th Century Literature editor, like the Nabokov Studies editor before him, also walked down the hall to the biology department and found someone who said the paper was wrong, and it was rejected. Coincidentally, that week, a friend, an editor at the Annals of Scholarship, asked me if I could give her something for her next issue, so I sent her the paper. I don't think Annals of Scholarship is widely circulated. No one has ever cited my paper. It's a shame because Stan and I do a great reading of Lolita as a parody of a lover's complaint pastoral, like Theocritus, Virgil, or Marvell. We argue that the extreme elements of the pastoral genre evolved by the mechanism of functionally neutral self-amplification. We claim that this is what's really behind structures attributed to sexual selection. The paper is on my ResearchGate profile if anyone wants to be the first to read it. By 2010, I'd pretty much given up on my literary scholarship. My work just wasn't getting any traction. And instead, I went into philosophy of science and biosemiotics. That's the theory of biological signaling and encoding. But Nabokov scholars Steve Blackwell and lepidopterist Kurt Johnson had always encouraged my work. In 2016, I was honored to be part of this volume, Fine Lines, Vladimir Nabokov's Scientific Art, which was made possible with support from Brian Boyd. With Steve and Kurt's help and feedback from all the other contributors, including some very famous lepidopterists, I was able to make my argument much clearer. In this paper, in addition to arguing that the Viceroy and Monarch are just lookalikes, not mimics, I also followed Nabokov's argument that the dead-leaf butterfly, called the kalima, is just a lookalike of an American elm leaf, whose disguise isn't much use to it since it lives in the tropics. Nabokov called this one of nature's practical jokes. The volume, published by Yale University Press, was among Nature's top 20 books of the year. In my paper, I leave very little doubt that Nabokov was correct about butterfly mimicry. With my fourth paper on this topic in 2019, I had moved beyond Nabokov's incomplete theory and deeper into the science of pattern formation. When I was at SFI, I had discovered Alan Turing's work on morphogenesis, and I recognized that it more or less proved that the pre-Darwinian evolutionary theorists that Nabokov followed were correct about how the direction of evolutionary processes might be constrained. In Mechanisms for Mimicry, I established biosemiotics, not Darwinism, as the appropriate lens through which we can understand mimicry. I also note that Turing-inspired equations might be used to estimate the probability that a given form might resemble another. And so now, using equations based on Turing and Nijhoot's work, I want to create a digital model to test Nabokov's theory that the monarch and the viceroy have non-utilitarian patterns, not at all shaped gradually by natural selection. I suspect that the viceroy pattern can be created with a very slight change in the parameters of the pattern of its ancestor, which probably look like the white admiral. But before explaining how the experiment might be conducted, let me quickly review Nabokov's argument. First, he was convinced that mimicry is one of the least likely adaptations to have been created gradually by natural selection, for several reasons. First, it would be difficult, statistically speaking, for selection to gradually shape one form, like the admiral, so that it transforms into another specific form, like the monarch, because this would be evolution toward a predefined goal. Natural selection doesn't work like that. In contrast to mimicry, camouflage could be formed by natural selection. Camouflage does not match a target model. It merely blends in with its surroundings. A vast number of different patterns might work for bark camouflage here. You just have to have similar color and shade. Essentially, only one pattern can be a match for mimicry. Statistically, random variation in selection would have a very difficult time pulling this off. Nabokov thought some butterfly resemblances, like that between the Viceroy and the Monarch, were more or less probable coincidences. He did not think that fitness selection was necessary or able to explain how such resemblances came to exist. He also believed that there could be other non-probable coincidences that produced other kinds of mimicry. In his fiction, Nabokov compared such coincidences to a funny typo that could give new meaning to a sentence. The chance that mimics choice, the flaw that looks like a flower. Here are some funny, non-utilitarian coincidences in beetle and flower morphology, and snake scales and the dead leaf butterfly. His second point was, if natural selection were shaping mimicry, the model species would have to have a stable genome, while the mimic's genome continued to mutate at a normal level. Mimicry could only evolve gradually if the model remained unchanged for millions of years, as Nabokov writes, quote, in the kind of immobility that a painter demands of his model. Third, according to the Batesian theory of mimicry, a tasty Viceroy species mimics the bitter-tasting monarchs. Nabokov, a devout empiricist, tasted them both and found they were both bitter. It took other lepidopterists watching mockingbirds do taste tests almost 50 years to reach the same conclusion. Fourth and finally, at some point, Nabokov apparently found a butterfly specimen that had a circular marking, a flaw in the pattern, that happened to look like a drop of dew because there was a line that ran through the faux droplet that was shifted in a perfect imitation of refraction. He didn't get a photo of that specimen, but this is what it might have looked like. The trompe-l'oeil, he noted, could only be an instance of non-utilitarian mimicry, for it would provide no advantage to the insect. This would be art for art's sake. If pure chance could create such remarkably artistic resemblances, it should have no trouble with the more prosaic ones. So now I will present the outline of the research proposal I was working on in 2020 with a graduate student in mathematics at ITMO University in St. Petersburg when the lockdown canceled the project. I would like the opportunity to take up these ideas again. I'm seeking someone who might be interested in testing the hypothesis with me. Butterfly wing patterns are formed by reaction diffusion processes that can be described with equations and represented digitally. These are some of the digital tools that are available for modeling wing pattern formation. It would not be very difficult to model the Monarch Viceroy pattern because it is relatively simple. Genes are not necessary to determine spatial patterns. Genes only determine the materials for the reactions. This is a BZ reaction. Two different chemical reactions are interacting in this petri dish. As one reaction runs out, another takes over. All such reactions involve activators and inhibitors that are coupled somehow. For instance, activation may create a byproduct that inhibits that activation. The exact materials involved may not matter so much as the activator-inhibitor relations between the materials. This butterfly, Kramer's 88, does not have its hind wings divided up into spoke-like sections as most butterflies do, so here the reaction looks very like that one in the petri dish. For most butterflies, the reaction diffusion is usually confined to these spoke-like sections, the wing cells. So if you want to create a realistic model of the process of pattern formation, you have to define a simulation area with boundaries that are similar to the shape of each wing cell. Likewise, Nabokov recognized that patterns were constrained by the shape of the wing cell. He made this argument many times. He was pretty unique in this argument in his day. There are a number of online simulators available for modeling reaction diffusion. Such simulators have been redesigned to model finger and toe formation, the patterns on seashells and fish scales. Since the shape of the container of the reaction affects the reaction, you need to design the tools for that. So that makes my project a little harder than just using a program like this out of the box. What makes this kind of modeling easy is that you don't have to know all the details of the underlying chemistry of the pigmentation process. You don't have to know what is acting as an activator or what is acting as an inhibitor. You just have to define the relationships between them. Then you would vary the parameters and observe the different results. Let me note that activator-inhibitor pathways are ubiquitous in biological processes. It's how processes are regulated, get switched on and off. The big block of text here, summarizing Naihout, describes a suspected switch mechanism for dark pigment production in butterflies. It involves two different biosynthetic pathways competing for the same molecule or sharing the same molecule, you could say. Understanding the detailed complexity of the process is not necessary for understanding how reaction diffusion in general works. Nabokov was able to simply look at the way patterns changed from specimen to recognize how the basic mechanism was working. This is a model of eye spot formation. In that petri dish we looked at, the pattern begins to form first wherever there is an instability, like a seed that initiates the reaction. In nascent butterfly wings, the chemistry of the wing cell is stable everywhere except at the edges, called the wing veins. The edges create a destabilizing difference that makes a difference. A reaction begins along the edge and propagates towards the center, where the two waves meet and annihilate each other. But sometimes a trace of activator gets pinched off as the line diffuses toward the body of the insect. These dots that are left behind might later form eye spots, or they might be stretched into lines. As Nabokov described the process, quote, spots occupy different positions in different species or genera, and what we see is a more or less coordinated longitude movement of spots. Certain comet tail traces of this progress are sometimes caught and fixed aberrationally. Here is a picture of that actual process. Unpatterned miniature versions of wings have already formed inside the caterpillar. The pattern formation begins during the latter half of the last larval instar stage and continues into the early pupal stage. Here we see a pre-pattern being laid down, forming the sources and sinks for pigment, which comes later. Nabokov referred to the pre-pattern as areas of topography that, at the second stage of pattern formation, seem to pull and shape the pigment. Here, Naihout, in 2003, has created digital simulations for a very simple butterfly pattern for which the individual wing cells don't make much of a difference. This is an all-over pattern. The G-Mesh software that Naihout used may be appropriate for the Monarch Viceroy project if it could allow one to manipulate the shape of the simulation field so that it resembles a butterfly wing cell area. Why haven't other researchers tried to do this kind of thing? I don't know. Maybe it's not as simple as I think it is. Maybe they are not interested in finding out what sort of non-utilitarian patterns are likely to form and change without selection pressure. The Monarch is on the top left, Viceroy is top right. They are not closely related, different genera, even though they look a lot alike. Below them are their close relatives. The Viceroy probably descends from a white admiral. The Monarch has a cousin called the Cuban king that looks like an admiral. It seems to me that the dark pigment on the two darker butterflies was able to diffuse for a longer period of time, covering up the orange that you see in the Monarch Viceroy pattern. The white markings appear to be the result of a chemical switch mechanism. We can assume that the substrate for melanin production is being exhausted, and in its wake, the substrate for white pigment is produced for a while before that is exhausted and allows the melanin substrate production to begin again. If you're not convinced yet that a Monarch Viceroy-like pattern can easily morph into a Cuban king admiral-like pattern in a single generation, look at this. The map butterfly has two distinct forms depending on whether or not the butterfly develops in spring or summer. The spring form looks a little like a Monarch Viceroy pattern, and the summer form looks a lot like a Cuban king white admiral pattern. The two in the middle are specimens that have been manipulated by exposing them to temperature differences during development, creating intermediaries between the spring and summer forms, so you can see the change occurring. Temperature affects ecdysone hormone production, which I think fixes the pattern. Temperature effects can mimic genetic effects and allows us to see that a single point genetic change could make a big difference in appearance. Note that in the summer form, the melanin has covered the orange. I have no doubt that Nabokov was correct to say that a gradual selection process is not needed to explain the resemblance between a monarch and a viceroy, and I hope that someday soon I can find the right mathematical biologist to work with me on this project. Can you imagine if it proves Nabokov right? School teachers worldwide will no longer be able to use the monarch viceroy mimicry to explain how natural selection works. The implications for this are enormous. Believing that random mutation coupled with competition is the only driver of creative processes has had negative effects on our culture. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Darwin's theory of natural selection explains very well how forms that are already in existence become more numerous. But it's not a theory of creativity. Trust an artist to understand how that works. Not incidentally, I have a collection of short stories inspired by these issues in science called Chance That Mimics Choice. I asked Mike Levin to contribute a foreword for the collection. We got to talking and decided to write science fiction together. He gives me the story idea or the plot, and I execute it. This week, we published our first short story called Animism in Interconnections, a journal of posthumanism. Thank you very much for your attention. If you're a mathematical biologist or work in computer modeling and you want to do work on this project, please contact me at alexander@dactyl.org. And here are some of the key publications behind this research.